Two bailiffs dragged a black teenage girl by her braids out of the courtroom. But what no one in that room knew was that the judge watching silently was her mother. She didn't scream, didn't beg, just stared into her mother's eyes as the courtroom froze. The gavel hit the desk, but no verdict had been read yet. Before we begin this story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you believe justice should never come at the cost of silence, hit like and subscribe, because tomorrow's special episode might just change how you see power. Forever. Her name was Aaliyah Johnson, 17, black, senior, honor student, scholarship recipient, editor of the school paper, clean record, sharp mind, soft voice, the kind of girl teachers used to brag about, the kind of girl who never made a scene, the kind of girl who that morning should have been presenting her science project on youth incarceration. Instead, she was sitting in a courtroom in handcuffs, her wrists bruised from zip ties that were too tight. It started without warning. A knock on her classroom door. Two officers stepped in. No explanation, just a folded document in hand and a demand. Aaliyah Johnson, stand up, you're coming with us. The classroom fell into a paralyzed silence. Aaliyah tried to ask why. She was told not to speak. When she resisted, one officer grabbed her by the elbow and whispered, "Resist harder, and we'll do this. The way you people like it." That was the first crack in her dignity. Public humiliation. A brilliant young girl dragged from school with no charges read aloud. No one called her mother. No one called a lawyer. The next time anyone saw her was in that courtroom. On the bench sat Judge Marlene Johnson, a woman known for her cold eyes and strict demeanor. A woman who didn't flinch when the officers tightened their grip on Aaliyah. People assumed she was just another tough judge. No one connected her to the girl being manhandled below. Not yet. Aaliyah was placed in a holding cell for 6 hours before even knowing what she was accused of. The paperwork said she was being investigated for inciting school disruption and threats against administration. The vague language was enough to keep her in custody, but not enough to make sense. She was offered a plea deal within 12 hours of her arrest. The message was clear. Confess, accept the charges, and you go home. If you fight, you stay locked up. She said no. That refusal is what led her to the courtroom. Her refusal to plead guilty to something she did not do. Her mother watched from the bench, face unreadable. The bailiffs gripped her tighter. The community outside didn't know the truth yet. They didn't know this was more than a student being punished, more than a mother forced into silence. This wasn't a family issue. This was a system moving to erase someone who was supposed to survive it. And that's what made Aaliyah dangerous. She wasn't just another statistic. She knew how to write, she knew how to speak, and she knew how to fight back. But in that moment, as the courtroom stared and the cameras rolled, none of that mattered. She was just a girl in chains, and her mother had not said a word. The footage went viral before noon. Shaky cell phone video from the back of the courtroom showed everything. Two bailiffs gripping a teenage girl by the arms, her body stiff, her head turned sharply toward the judge. The moment the gavel fell, the girl didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She just stared. Silent. Controlled. The internet reacted fast and loud. Twitter exploded. TikTok dissected every frame. Instagram captioned her face with fire emojis and the words, "They messed with the wrong one." But no one truly knew what had happened. What followed wasn't justice. It was damage control. The school released a cold statement that Aaliyah Johnson had displayed behavior in violation of student conduct and was temporarily suspended pending investigation. There were no specifics, no evidence, no opportunity for her to speak. Within 24 hours, she was removed from the honor roll. Her scholarship was frozen. Her access to school records was locked. The student paper pulled every article she had written. Her locker was emptied without notice. At school, the hallway became a war zone. Half of the students whispered support. The other half turned their backs. Rumors bloomed like weeds. Someone claimed she had brought a knife. Someone said she made threats to bomb the principal's car. None of it was true, but none of it needed to be. That was the first layer, a public character assassination. On the surface, it looked like disciplinary action. Beneath it was the machinery of a system scrubbing her name from every file it once celebrated. By the third day, Aaliyah returned to school under the condition of silent observation. No interactions, no class participation. She was a ghost in her own school. That afternoon she went to the bathroom. 3 white girls followed her in. They had been waiting. One of them locked the door behind them. The one in front pressed her. Phone to Aaliyah's face. The other 2 circled. "You think you're special now?" The girl sneered. "What are you going to do, call your mummy, Judge?" Aaliyah didn't answer. The first punch was to the side of her face. The second landed in her ribs. By the time the door opened, Aaliyah was on the floor, bleeding from her lip. The girls had already uploaded a video to Snapchat. The caption read, "Criminals get what they deserve." In the video, it looked like she had swung first. That was intentional. She was suspended again by the end of the day. The police weren't called. The other girls weren't punished. The school cited mutual aggression and closed the investigation. Aaliyah sat in the principal's office with an ice pack on her face, while they handed her a form stating she could not attend classes until further notice. No one asked if she was okay. No one asked for her version. That was layer 2, institutional neutrality as silent violence. Outside, parents began whispering. Aaliyah had become the girl with issues. Some even said she had mental problems. A mother in the PTA meeting said, "Well, she must have done something." Aaliyah walked home that evening alone. A passing car slowed beside her. A voice called, "Out. Should have stayed in your place." The car didn't stop. That was the third layer. When a single girl's silence threatens the comfort of an entire community, it is not her that breaks the system. It is the system that starts to erase her, and that erasure had only just begun. Aaliyah didn't speak about the attack. Not to the school, not to her classmates, not even to her mother. But that didn't mean she stayed silent. 2 days after the assault, she sat in her bedroom with her busted lip still healing, and opened her laptop. Her hands moved slowly, fingers stiff with tension. She drafted a formal letter to the school principal. She laid out the sequence of events. She described the threats. She mentioned the video. She did not ask for sympathy. She demanded accountability. She submitted the letter and included a copy of the security footage request form. Then she waited. There was no response. The next morning, she approached the front office. The receptionist told her the principal was unavailable. The day after, her email was marked "Read," but never replied to. On the third day, she returned home to find a sealed envelope addressed to her mother. Inside was a letter from the school board, stating that her behavior had created an ongoing distraction to the learning environment. No apology, no mention of the assault, no acknowledgement of the students who attacked her. That was the pattern. Aaliyah had entered a system designed not just to ignore her, but to erase her attempts to be heard. She started keeping her phone in record mode. Every hallway conversation, every hostile comment. She kept audio logs. She saved every online message. She stored every piece in a folder she called "When They Say I Lied." Then came the teacher, Mr. Glenn, African-American, mid-40s, former history department chair. He noticed her recording during lunch. He didn't say anything that day, but the next morning he pulled her aside. "I know what they're doing," he said quietly. "They did it to me, too." At first, Aaliyah didn't believe him. He was just a substitute now, no office, no influence. Most students barely noticed him, but then he told her his story. 5 years earlier, Mr. Glenn had been removed from the faculty for inappropriate curriculum choices. What he had really done was teach a unit on systemic oppression using case studies of local police incidents. The parents complained. The board acted. His reputation never recovered. Still he stayed, quiet, invisible, waiting. Now he offered her something simple, information. He handed her a flash drive. "What's on it?" she asked. "Documents they buried," he said. "Disciplinary patterns, suspension records by race, things they don't want public." Aaliyah took it. It was the first time in weeks she felt something other than fear. She went home and began building her case. It wasn't a legal brief. It was a strategy. She would expose the patterns, the numbers, the silence. But systems don't. Stay still when threatened. That night she heard banging on the front door. She opened it to 2 police officers. They had a warrant, not for her phone, not for her locker, for her computer. The report claimed probable cause tied to a recent anonymous message sent to the school threatening to release sensitive staff data. Aaliyah had sent nothing, but that didn't matter. The officers stepped in. Her mother wasn't home. They took the hard drive, the flash drive, her notes, her phone. They didn't take her. Not yet, but they looked her in the eye as they left. "You like collecting information?" one officer said. "You should. Be careful what you collect. Sometimes it bites back." They didn't need to arrest her. They needed to scare her. That was the second wave of retaliation. The first was silence. The second was surveillance. Aaliyah sat down in the dark after they left, her room stripped of tools, but her mind remained untouched, and fear had stopped being useful. Aaliyah wasn't the only one who had noticed what was happening. By the end of the week, a young journalist named Kira Simmons reached out through a mutual contact. She worked for a small but rising news platform that focused on youth voices and civil rights. She had seen the courtroom video. She had done her homework. She wanted to talk. They met in a coffee shop 2 towns away at a corner table near the back. Kira didn't ask for sensationalism. She asked for facts. Aaliyah gave her everything: the footage, the flash drive backups, the letter to the principal, the audio recordings that had survived in her cloud account. Every page was date-stamped, organized and clean. Kira listened. Then she leaned in. "This is big," she said, "but it's dangerous." Aaliyah nodded. She already knew. 2 days later, Kira submitted her article to the editorial board. It was scheduled for release the following Monday. That Friday, Kira received a call from her editor. The article had been pulled. No explanation, no alternative publishing date, no discussion. When she pushed back, her boss became distant. Then her access to the publishing system was revoked. Then her contract was reviewed. Then she was gone. By Monday, Kira Simmons had been removed from the platform altogether. Her staff email returned a blank error. Her author page had been deleted. All traces of the story disappeared with her. Aaliyah tried to call, no answer. She texted. The reply came from an unknown number. "Let it go." That was the first voice silenced, and it didn't stop there. One of Aaliyah's classmates, Jamal, had been in the hallway during the bathroom assault. He had seen part of it. He hadn't spoken up, but after hearing what happened to Kira, he changed his mind. He asked to meet her. They sat on the school's outdoor bleachers at dusk. He told her what he saw, who said what, who locked the door. He agreed to go with her to the school board. He never made it there. That weekend, Jamal's parents received an anonymous email accusing him of distributing illegal materials from school computers. Screenshots were attached, fabricated, but believable. His college application portal was flagged. A guidance counselor called his parents and suggested Jamal take a semester off to avoid complications. He changed his mind. He told Aaliyah he couldn't risk it. He told her he was sorry. He never spoke of it again. And just like that, another witness disappeared. It was coordinated. It was surgical. It was invisible from the outside. But from the inside, Aaliyah saw the pattern. First, the institution ignored her. Then it tried to discredit her. Now it was silencing anyone who got too close. She began to feel what Mr. Glenn must have felt all those years ago. They weren't just erasing her. They were erasing the entire narrative, one piece at a time. Aaliyah knew what was coming next. The whispers, the voided support, the silence that thickened around her like wet concrete. But silence was not safety, and compliance had bought her nothing. So she started moving again. First, she rewrote her entire account of events, not as a letter, not as a complaint, as a manifesto. It documented the shifts in the school's disciplinary patterns, the racial trends in punishment, the timeline of her own targeting, and the way the school had responded to her every attempt to speak. She attached her own photos, screenshots, transcripts, references. Then she sent it to every school board member's official email. None responded. So she printed it. She dropped copies in teachers' mailboxes, slid them under classroom doors, left one at the main office, taped to her red folder labeled Unredacted Truth. Still no answer. The hallway felt colder after that. Students avoided her more obviously. Teachers stopped meeting her eyes. Someone tagged her locker with red spray paint. Liar. She wiped it off with her sleeve and kept walking. That night, she returned to the only place she hadn't yet gone, the maintenance wing. At the end of the hallway near the loading dock, the night custodians met during shift change. Among them was Mrs. Donnelly, a quiet woman in her 50s who had worked at the school for over 20 years. Aaliyah waited until she saw her alone, pushing a cart of supplies. She approached gently, hands open, voice low. "Mrs. Donnelly, you were working the night I was dragged from class." The woman looked at her, eyes tired but not unkind. "I was," she said. "I think you saw more than anyone else did." Mrs. Donnelly didn't reply. "I don't need you to say anything now," Aaliyah continued. "But if you ever decide that silence doesn't feel right anymore, I'll listen." Mrs. Donnelly stared for a moment, then slowly nodded. It wasn't a promise, but it wasn't a rejection. Aaliyah walked away knowing it was the closest thing to hope she had received in days. That evening she curled up with a pillow and forced herself to sleep early, but even in sleep she was waiting. At 3:17 a.m. her phone buzzed once. No message, just a file, an unnamed video. She clicked play. The security feed, grainy, black and white, time-stamped. It showed the hallway outside the girls' restroom. 3 girls entered. 1 stood guard by the door. 1 pulled something from her bag. 1 wrapped her hand and punched. It showed everything. Aaliyah sat up. The video ended with the door opening again. Mrs. Donnelly walked into frame. She had saved the footage. Aaliyah stared at the screen, the corners of her eyes burning. She didn't cry. She stood up and started writing again. But hope has gravity, and systems sense when it moves. The next day a letter appeared in her mother's mailbox. It was from the school board. Official letterhead. Polite language. They were initiating disciplinary proceedings against Aaliyah for manipulating student records and illegally acquiring school surveillance. There was no evidence listed, no process for appeal, just a date, a hearing closed to the public, set to take place in 72 hours. She had one last move to make. She walked to Mr. Glenn's classroom during lunch. He was there, alone. Grading. She placed the flash drive on his desk. "You said they broke you," she said, "but you're still here." He looked at her, quiet. "I'm not asking you to risk everything," she said. "Just something." He took the flash. "Drive." "Go home," he said. The next morning, an email went out to every teacher, student, and parent in the district. It was anonymous. The subject line read, "This is what you're not supposed to know." Attached were data sheets, breakdowns of disciplinary actions by race, evidence of internal memos, emails between board members mocking complaints, and most damning of all, the full video of the bathroom assault. It hit the district like a hammer. The school board shut down external communication lines. The local press circled like vultures. But Aaliyah was not safe. She was summoned to the hearing anyway. The letter made it clear. Attendance was mandatory, and failure to comply would result in immediate expulsion. Her mother read the letter twice, then folded it without a word. Neither of them spoke that night, because they both knew this was not the final fight. It was only the first round. Judge. Marlene Johnson had not spoken Aaliyah's name in 2 weeks, not in chambers, not at home, not even in her own mind. It was survival. She had spent her career perfecting the art of containment. A controlled tone, an unshakable stare, the ability to pass judgment without showing it in her face. That control had kept her on the bench for 14 years in a district that had never before appointed a black woman to the judiciary. It was the same control that kept her silent when her daughter was dragged from her courtroom. But silence is not safety, and neutrality is not justice. Behind closed doors, pressure was mounting. She had received 3 anonymous letters since Aaliyah's arrest, typed no return address, hand-delivered to her mailbox. The first warned her to choose loyalty over blood. The second said, "One wrong ruling and you lose the robe." The third included a printed image of Aaliyah, eyes blackened, her face distorted with digital edits. It was not a threat. It was a message. Marlene was not just being watched. She was being tested, and the test was coming soon. Because the next case on her docket involved Aaliyah's official hearing. A judge can recuse herself when there's a conflict of interest, but in this case, the board refused her that option. The justification was bureaucratic. Continuity and judicial presence was the language they used, but Marlene knew the truth. They wanted to use her. They wanted the image of a black mother condemning her own daughter. It would silence the outrage. Justify the system. They were offering her the illusion of power in exchange for complicity. She sat in her chambers and stared at the file. Inside was her daughter's name, her birthday. The charges were vague, but sufficient for administrative action. She flipped through the documentation. Nothing in it resembled the child she had raised. There was no reference to the attacks. No mention of the footage. No line about the silence that had devoured her. Only 3 signatures, one from the principal, one from the district lawyer, and one blank space at the end, the judge's signature. Hers. If she signed it, Aaliyah would be formally charged and detained pending review. If she didn't, she would be placed on administrative leave. Her staff would be reassigned. Her docket suspended. Her name would be flagged for judicial misconduct. They didn't need to remove her. They just needed her out of the way. She looked up at the ceiling. At the fluorescent light flickering overhead, she remembered Aaliyah as a child, reading courtroom transcripts in the living room, asking what due process meant. She had answered with pride back then. Now the word tasted like rust. She placed the pen on the folder and stepped away. She didn't sign, but she didn't fight either, and that was its own form of betrayal. The next morning she arrived to find a new memo on her desk. It was short. Due to procedural conflicts, she would be reassigned for the remainder of the month. Her chambers would be closed for review, effective immediately. Her badge still worked at the door, but her authority had already been revoked. She walked out of the courthouse and into her car. She didn't start the engine. She just sat there, the key in her hand, the folder in her lap. And for the first time in 14 years, Judge Marlene Johnson did not know what to do with the law. The detention center was small, low-rise, hidden behind the courthouse. No signs, no press, just a single locked gate and a uniformed officer who didn't ask questions. Aaliyah was transferred quietly. No trial, no sentencing, just a temporary hold. Ordered through internal school procedure, the kind that required no media coverage and no public justification. She wasn't placed with other minors. They said it was for her safety. What they meant was they didn't want her speaking. Her room was cold. Pale walls, a narrow cot, a steel sink that ran water with the smell of rust. She wasn't allowed books, no phone, no visitors, only 10 minutes a day outside the cell. Twice a week, she was permitted to walk the hallway to a separate room labeled Education Unit, where worksheets were dropped in front of her with no instruction. She answered them all anyway. They didn't care. Inside the unit, she met other girls. Not directly. They weren't allowed to speak, but eyes told stories. There was a girl named Tiana who limped when she walked, another named Elise who flinched at every knock on the door. None of them looked older than 17. All of them were black or brown. Aaliyah watched the patterns. She watched who got called in for review and who didn't return. She listened to the guards, how they laughed outside her door, how they whispered numbers instead of names. On her 6th day, she was called into the common room for a scheduled behavioral check. The officer sat with a report in front of him. "You've been quiet," he said. She didn't answer. He tapped the pen against the table. "You know, kids like you are usually out by now, but your name keeps raising flags." She looked at him steady. No comment. Still nothing, he leaned in. "You're not special, Aaliyah. You're not going to be a hero in here. You're just another number." She didn't flinch. He stood up and motioned to the guards. "Put her in Unit D. Let her make some new friends, Unit." D was the disciplinary block. The girls inside were older, harsher. Some already legal adults awaiting transfer. The cells were smaller. The lights never fully turned off. That night, she was assigned a bunk next to a girl named Zara, who had been held for over 9 months without a formal charge. Zara didn't ask questions. She just watched, On the third night, Aaliyah heard yelling down the hallway, then banging, then silence. The next morning, Elise was gone. No one explained where. That day, Aaliyah requested a grievance form. The officer laughed. She insisted. He handed her a blank sheet of paper, no envelope, no pen. She returned it blank. That night, she wrote everything from memory on the back of her worksheet. She folded it inside her pillowcase. She had no idea who would find it, but she needed something that could survive her. On day 11, she was sitting alone in the unit when another girl approached and whispered just one sentence. "They're transferring you tomorrow." No reason, no destination, just movement. That night, Aaliyah stayed awake, listening to the vents and the breathing of people who no longer believed anyone was coming for them. The next morning, they gave her 5 minutes to pack. She had nothing to take. She stepped into the transport van with her wrists bound again. No one told her where they were going. But something told her it would be worse. Something told her it would be the place where silence became law, and law became a weapon, and the van moved without a word. No conversation, no radio, just the sound of tires over wet pavement and the weight of something unspoken in the air. Aaliyah sat still, staring at the barred window. She had no idea where she was being taken. No lawyer had been assigned. No hearing had been scheduled. This was not detention. This was disappearance. But systems, no matter how carefully built, always leave cracks. That morning, in a newsroom across the city, a producer opened a file marked Anonymous Drop. It contained a 32-second clip from a Chiao school hallway camera. In it, 3 girls surrounded another inside a restroom. One hit, one filmed, one laughed. A 4th person entered the frame just at the end. The timestamp showed it was the same day Aaliyah had been suspended for fighting. The woman who entered the scene wore janitorial blues, Mrs. Donnelly. The clip cut out just as she stepped forward. By noon, the video had spread to 3 local outlets. By 2 o'clock, a national education watchdog account had reposted it. By nightfall, it was trending on social media. No narration, no context, just the title. Is this what they called mutual aggression? Students recognized the girls in the video. Teachers whispered. One parent emailed the district superintendent, then another, then dozens more. By that evening, the school board issued a prepared statement saying the footage was taken out of context and currently under internal review. But they said nothing about Aaliyah because they didn't know where she was. Inside the van, Aaliyah had no idea the video had leaked. She was dropped at a new facility, taller, surrounded by fences with live patrol. It was a juvenile relocation center, technically part of the state's overflow response program, but in reality, it was a place to bury cases too messy to keep above ground. Inside, the tone shifted. She was no longer seen as a student with disciplinary issues. She was now coded as media sensitive, which meant her name rang alarms in the system, which meant new restrictions, no outside contact, no calls, no visits, no paper with her name on it allowed outside the building. The only person permitted to see her was a liaison appointed by the Department of Youth Oversight. He was not a lawyer, he was not an advocate, he was a monitor, and he smiled too much on her. The second day, he told her a story about a girl who had made things harder for herself by talking too much. On the third, he gave her a sheet to sign. It was a waiver agreeing to mediation instead of formal review. She refused. On the 4th day, she was moved to a solitary room under the claim of facility safety protocol. That night, while lying on a hard cot staring at the vent above, her Aaliyah heard it, a voice soft, uncertain, from the vent in the next cell. Is it true? Aaliyah didn't answer. The voice came again. The video. They say it's everywhere. They say you're the girl in the video. Aaliyah sat up. How did you hear that? I clean staff offices sometimes, the voice whispered. They tried to delete it. But one of the lawyers printed it out. He said, they lost the narrative. That phrase stayed with her. They lost the narrative. It meant something had shifted. She was no longer invisible. Someone, somewhere, had broken the chain of silence. She lay back down, a small thread of light pressing through the crack near the... To her, for the first time in weeks, it didn't feel like she was losing. But it didn't feel safe either, Because when a system begins to unravel, it does not go quietly. It lashes out. It protects itself. And it punishes those who remind it of what it did. The girl in the video was no longer just a victim. She was evidence, and that made her dangerous in a different way. Judge Marlene Johnson sat in her parked car in front of the courthouse, hands locked around the steering wheel, eyes fixed on nothing. The building no longer recognized her badge. Her chambers had been sealed, her schedule reassigned. They didn't fire her. That would have been too obvious. Instead, they erased her by process, removed from every bench, every ruling, every case that mattered. But they made one mistake. They left her free. And Marlene had not survived this long by being careless. She drove to a small cafe on the edge of town, one with no cameras, no online menu, no digital trace. She waited at a table in the corner until a man sat down across from her. Early 50s, salt and pepper beard, grey slacks, black overcoat. He worked for the Office of Federal Judicial Integrity, but he wasn't here in any official capacity. His name was Wallace, and she had known him since law school. They spoke in short phrases. Names were not mentioned, only positions, only patterns. She laid out everything she had seen. The letters, the forced docket, the pressure to sign her own daughter's detention papers, the manipulation of administrative law to circumvent due process. Wallace listened without blinking. He asked one question. "Do you have proof?" Marlene reached into her coat and placed a slim drive on the table. "I recorded the meeting, the one where they gave me the choice." His face didn't change, but his hands closed over the drive like it was made of glass. "If I act on this," he said quietly, "I can't protect you from retaliation. This is a systemic probe. The blowback could be severe." Marlene nodded. "I'm not asking for protection. I'm asking for pressure." Wallace stood. "I'll see what I can shake loose." When he left, Marlene stayed seated for a long time. She didn't drink the coffee she ordered. She just waited. 2 hours later, she returned home to find an envelope taped to her front door. No stamp. No name. Inside was a single printed photo. It showed her and Alia at a community justice conference from years earlier. The photo had a red X drawn across it. That night, she received an anonymous call, blocked number. A man's voice, calm. "You're already off the bench, don't try to make a return." The line went dead. Marlene didn't sleep. Instead, she began preparing. Not for a press conference, not for a public appeal, but for one moment. The moment the system slipped. The moment it opened the door just wide enough to let her back in. And that moment came sooner than expected. 2 days later, the judge assigned to Alia's emergency hearing withdrew for personal health complications. The court scrambled. There were only 2 eligible alternates within jurisdiction. Marlene was one of them. She received the reassignment order at 7:42 a.m. By 8:05, she was inside the building. Her staff wasn't notified. Her chambers were still locked. But her presence was legal. She had jurisdiction, and she had something no one else in the courthouse had, a name worth listening to. That day, behind closed doors, she made a single phone call. Not to a journalist, not to a lawyer, but to a Federal Review Committee official who owed Wallace a favor. She didn't ask for permission. She declared intent. "I will be present in my daughter's hearing. I will intervene. If legal violation occurs, I will be seen." She hung up before he could respond. Because this wasn't about legality anymore. It was about timing. And Marlene had learned how to use time like a weapon. They had taken her title, but not her voice. And for the first time in weeks, she planned to use it. The courtroom was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from order, but the kind that holds its breath. Alia was escorted through the side entrance, wrists bound again, hair tied back in a plain knot. Her face looked thinner, but her eyes sharper. She scanned the room. No familiar faces. The judge assigned to the case had been replaced with a new appointment from an adjacent district. A man with a cold tone and the kind of smile that looked better on paper. There were no cameras allowed, no public seats filled, only a select group of school board members, one district attorney, and a clerk tapping notes too fast to be thoughtful. Aliyah was told she could waive legal representation for an expedited process. She declined. The clerk paused. Then the hearing began. The charges were read aloud. Unlawful possession of restricted district data, violation of school, property codes, incitement of peer disruption through unverified information. She listened without moving. They produced documents but no witnesses, statements but no cross-examinations. Aliyah raised her hand. The judge hesitated. "You may speak," he said. She stood, no lawyer, no family, just her voice. "I was assaulted by 3 students inside school grounds. That event was recorded. The footage was deleted internally and later recovered. I have submitted that footage to the state ombudsman. I also submitted district-level disciplinary data reflecting a pattern of racial targeting over 5 years. The judge narrowed his eyes. "You are not permitted to introduce new evidence here." "I am not," she said. "But the state is, and they already have." He frowned. "You were detained lawfully based on board recommendation." "Recommendation is not ruling. I have never stood trial. I have never been charged in civil or criminal court." The silence in the room changed shape, less passive, more calculating. The district attorney leaned forward. "If Miss Johnson is implying misconduct, she should direct that to the district grievance board, not in this room." Aliyah didn't answer him. She turned to the judge. "I have filed a written motion to be released from custody pending review of that footage. The board does not have authority to override juvenile court in the presence of a due process violation." The judge froze. The clerk stopped typing. A door at the back of the courtroom opened. The room turned. Judge Marlene Johnson walked in, slow, deliberate, in full robe. She carried no file, only presence. The judge at the bench stood unsure. "I was informed this bench was vacant for emergency rotation," Marlene said calmly. "As presiding judge with jurisdiction, I am here to resume oversight." The district attorney spoke quickly. "This is irregular. She has conflict of interest." Marlene stepped forward. "And yet, no formal recusal was processed. That makes your objection procedural, not legal." The clerk didn't move. She turned to her daughter. "Aliyah Johnson, you have the floor." Aliyah looked at her mother, then back to the judge's chair. She spoke with no hesitation. "I submit motion for immediate release pending judicial review. I also request protective investigation into the handling of my case under Administrative Code Section 49B. Marlene looked at the board members. "Any objections?" Silence. The room had become a vacuum. She picked up the gavel. "Motion. Granted." It fell once against the desk. Aliyah's cuffs were removed. She did not cry. She didn't even look relieved. She looked focused, because she knew what would happen next. Winning in the room was never the end. It was only the beginning of what had to come after, and the system would not go quietly. Aliyah walked out of the courtroom into a crowd that hadn't been invited. Parents, teachers, students, reporters with cameras they weren't allowed to use. No one said anything. They just watched her. Not as a girl released, but as something they didn't know how to name anymore. She didn't stop. She didn't wave. She walked straight into the car where her mother waited in the driver's seat. Marlene didn't say a word. She didn't need to. That night, they sat at the kitchen table. Aliyah placed a folder between them. Inside were the backup files, copies of recordings, incident logs, and printouts of disciplinary records. Marlene opened it slowly. "These are clean," she said. "They're enough," Aliyah replied. The next day, Marlene filed a motion in federal court for judicial inquiry. Simultaneously, Aliyah submitted a personal complaint to the Department of Education's Civil Rights Division. She didn't want media coverage. She wanted process. 3 days later, a hearing was scheduled. This time, the room was open to public observation. Rows of students came. So did parents who had once whispered that she was unstable. At the center of the hearing, Aliyah stood behind the microphone. One by one, she played the audio files she had saved, the recording of the school administrator mocking her GPA, the conversation between 2 board members laughing about letting the angry girl burn out, the deleted footage of the bathroom attack, restored and shown on a central monitor. Silence fell over the room like dust. Then came the testimonies. Jamal stepped forward. He had remained silent during the early days, but now his voice didn't. Shake. He told them what he saw, what he heard. He told them why he was scared and why he wasn't anymore. Then came Mrs. Donnelly. She spoke softly with a sheet of paper shaking in her hand. She described what she saw, what she was told to ignore. She ended with only one sentence. I kept the footage because I knew she was the only one telling the truth. The room didn't applaud. They didn't need to, because truth doesn't need noise. It just needs a place. To land. The school board sat frozen. The district lawyer whispered furiously into his phone. But the damage was done. The system hadn't just failed, it had documented its own collapse. And now everyone could see it. Later that evening, the local news aired the footage in full. Not just the clip of the attack, but the transcripts, the patterns, the silences. The following morning, 2 school board members resigned. The superintendent filed for early retirement. The principal was placed on leave pending investigation, but no one called it justice, because justice would have required them to care before the evidence came. Justice would have meant not having to survive first. That night, Aliyah returned home, placed the folder on a shelf and sat in silence. Not the silence of being ignored, but the silence after truth has been spoken. It was the kind that filled the room, and stayed. For 48 hours, Aliyah lived in a fragile calm. She had won her release. She had exposed the system, and for the first time, the people who once ignored her were forced to listen. But systems don't die with one loss. They regroup. They retaliate. 2 days after the hearing, Aliyah and her mother left the courthouse through the back entrance. It was quiet. No reporters, no threats, just the street. They walked toward their car parked along the curb, a plain black sedan, unmarked. As Marlene opened the door, a silver SUV without plates turned the corner too fast. It didn't swerve. It accelerated. Aliyah saw it before her mother did. She screamed. The impact hit the passenger side. Glass exploded. The world tilted. When she opened her eyes, smoke filled the air. The front of the car was crushed. The SUV had fled. People ran toward them. Aliyah reached for her mother, dazed, her own blood running from her temple. Marlene was still breathing, but her arm was pinned and she wasn't speaking. The paramedics arrived 6 minutes later. The incident was filed as a hit and run, but the cameras on that street had been disabled. Every one. When the police came to ask questions, they were polite. Too polite. They didn't take notes. They didn't ask about threats. Aliyah watched the officer's eyes. He didn't write down a thing. That night, in the hospital waiting room, Wallace called. He had already heard. "You need to understand," he said. "This isn't just about a district anymore. You embarrassed them. They're not going to let you walk away clean." "I didn't ask to survive," Aliyah said. "I asked to be heard." "Then be ready," Wallace said, "because when power breaks, it shatters sharp." The next morning, Judge Marlene Johnson was moved to a private recovery suite under federal observation. The injury to her arm required surgery, but it wasn't the fracture that hurt most, it was the silence. Aliyah stood beside her bed. Neither of them spoke. Then Marlene whispered, "They won't stop." Aliyah nodded. "I know." Outside, the hospital, a crowd had gathered. Quiet, respectful. People who had seen the footage, parents, students. Some held candles, others held signs that read, "We see you." But inside, Aliyah knew visibility was not protection. The retaliation had only confirmed what she already understood. Justice doesn't end with exposure. It ends when power fears truth enough to attack it. And if they were still attacking, then her voice still mattered. She went home that night and found a single envelope slipped under the door. Inside was a page torn from her childhood journal, her handwriting, a note she once wrote at age 9 after her first courtroom visit. It said, "One day I'll sit in that chair too." Across it, someone had drawn a red slash. No name, no message, just intent. That was their final strike. But instead of silencing her, it reminded her of something more permanent than fear. She had never wanted revenge. She wanted consequence, and consequence was coming, not with a speech, not with a file, but with what she was about to become. Aaliyah didn't wait for recovery. 3 weeks after the hospital incident, she stood on a stage at the National Youth Education Conference in Washington, D.C. Her invitation had come from a congresswoman who read the full transcript of the inquiry hearing. Aaliyah accepted it without hesitation. She wore no makeup, no accessories. Just a dark blazer and a plain white shirt. She didn't speak about herself. She spoke about numbers, the disproportionate suspensions, the racial gap in school-based arrests, the invisible pathways from classroom to courtroom. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She simply laid the truth down, one line at a time, until the room was silent. When she stepped off stage, reporters followed her to the sidewalk. She answered one question. "I'm not here to talk about justice. I'm here to talk about memory, because this country forgets too quickly, and I won't let it forget me." 2 months later, she launched the Justice School Initiative with the help of a non-profit legal foundation. It wasn't a school in the traditional sense. It was a hybrid center, located inside an old community library, designed to provide legal education, mentorship, and trauma recovery for Black youth affected by disciplinary discrimination. She didn't advertise it. She just opened the door. In the first week, 12 students came. By the third month, over 100. Some came after school. Some came instead of school. They brought stories, they brought scars, and they brought questions no one had ever answered for them before. Aaliyah didn't pretend to have all the answers, but she taught them what she knew: how to document, how to speak with precision, how to file a complaint no one could throw away. Meanwhile, her mother, still recovering, returned to work in a new role, not as a local judge, but as a senior advisor on juvenile justice reform at the federal level. The road there had not been direct, but it had been deliberate. Marlene no longer sat behind a bench. She stood beside victims, listened, and rewrote policy drafts with the force of someone who had once been told to sign her own child's sentence. They rarely talked about the past, but every Sunday, they met at the same kitchen table where the first folder had been placed, and every time Aaliyah looked up from her notes, she saw her mother watching. Not like a judge, not even like a mother, but like someone who understood what it meant to be. Broken and rebuilt without apology. Aaliyah's name began to circulate on scholarship lists, then on youth advisory panels, then as a consultant for community legal education. But none of it changed how she walked. Head steady, eyes open. Shoulders set, because impact is not measured by applause. It is measured by what still stands after the walls fall. And Aaliyah Johnson was still standing. When the DOJ task force concluded their investigation, the report came with no soft edges. Sunvale's juvenile justice system had failed its constitutional duty. Multiple officers were found to have falsified reports against Black minors. School resource officers were proven to have used physical force in non-threatening situations with no internal consequence. Judge Marlene Johnson was the only one who had ever filed complaints. All of them had been dismissed as non-urgent. The report didn't just indict individuals. It exposed a culture that began with stereotypes calcified into policy and weaponized authority against the voiceless. It led to the resignation of 3 high-ranking law enforcement officials. 2 school board members were removed by public vote, and for the first time in city history, a civilian review board was granted full subpoena power over police conduct in schools. But the true reckoning didn't come from the institutions, it came from the people. At a City Hall town meeting, more than 400 residents showed up. Most of them had never spoken into a microphone before, but that night they did. A Black father stood and read the detention record of his 10-year-old son, who was arrested for non-compliance after refusing to hand over a candy bar. A teacher shared how her emails warning about excessive force were ignored. Latina grandmother recounted how her granddaughter stopped talking after her courtroom encounter with Officer Beckley. Each story wasn't just a drop in a bucket. They were a flood. And at the center of it all, Aaliyah sat with her notebook closed. Because the time for documenting had passed. Now it was time to rebuild. Months later, The Justice School initiative expanded into 3 new cities. The local police department adopted a revised use of force policy specific to minors, and Judge Marlene Johnson was invited to speak at a judicial conference on racial bias and youth rights. She declined. Instead, she sent someone else, Aaliyah, not as a victim, not as a witness, but as a speaker. Her topic was not revenge, it was recovery. She began her speech with a single line. Some stories do not end with healing. They begin with harm and live in what we do next. And in the front row, officials who once ignored the quiet girl who stood alone in court leaned forward because they could feel it now. The system had trembled, and it would not forget her.